dear students, in this class we're going to discuss about the rise of absolutism, otherwise the rise of absolutist monarchies in various parts of Europe. Now here in this image I've given here pictures of different monarchs who ruled over various countries in Europe. Now, when did absolutism begin in Europe? Roughly the period can be said as between 1550 and 1800 period. So you really have to know the period when there were absolutist rulers in various countries of the world. You have to know that it was not a phenomenon which affected just a country. It was like a trend, one after the other. Various countries of Europe reached the stage of absolutism or absolute monarchs, and those countries were Spain, England, France, Prussia, and also many other countries. So they came under the grip of absolutism. Now, what do you actually mean by the term absolutism, or what do you understand when I say the absolute monarchs controlled power? So there were rulers who held all the power in a country. They were absolutists. There were no checks and balances on their power. That means they did not really consult the parliament, nor there were any advisory bodies to control these absolute monarchs. So you have to know that these monarchs became powerful. They usurped power. They were so powerful that nobody really influenced them. They acted according to their own whims and fancies. So that is what is known as absolutism. You have to actually differentiate it from benevolent despotism. Benevolent despots were rulers who ruled for the welfare of the people, though they were despots. Absolutists, they were rulers who ruled just according to their own whims and fancies. Okay, now this is a theory which most of the absolutist rulers of the period applied to their rule, and that was the divine right theory. Well, Louis XIV of France was a ruler who actually is very much connected with this theory, because when we discuss this theory, his name comes first, Louis XIV of France. And you must have studied in school how he said, "Inique shesham pralayam," after me deluge, that he considered himself as so indispensable. Okay, Louis XIV. Now it was the belief, according to the divine right theory, that God sent these rulers. Divine will, as per the divine will, and the people were supposed to obey these rulers. If the people are good, they get a good ruler. If the people are bad, they get a bad ruler, and they don't have any chances to escape from the wrath of this ruler. And that is what is known as divine right theory. So we see how the absolutist rulers ruled according to this theory, that they were sent by God and they were sent to rule over people according to their own interests. Okay, now why do you think 1550 and 1800, between that period, why do you think such a large number of absolutist monarchs came up in various parts of Europe? The reasons, when we examine the reason, we see how the power of the Holy Roman Empire dwindled. So, Holy Roman Empire had in fact controlled the western part of Europe. They were so powerful, but then after a point of time in the medieval period, they did not have much to do. So there was an absence of a very powerful central power, that was the Holy Roman Empire. Now, second point I have written here, how Protestant Reformation had created a schism in the church, and it was a movement which was meant to reform Christianity. Anglican churches and Protestant churches were formed in various parts of Europe, and we could see how this was also a reason where people lost their interest in Pope as spiritual head. They started showing their allegiance to their ruler. This was exactly what the absolutist monarchs wanted, because when we discuss Anglican Reformation, we know like how the ruler did not like the people's idea of considering the Pope as a spiritual supremo. The ruler wanted him to be considered as their head, as their superior protector. And that is why we say how Protestant Reformation questioned the practice of the Roman Church, and Church kind of became an institution which was considered to be abusive, which had a lot of obnoxious practices, which really made the church something not a good institution in the medieval period. Especially, it was that reason where you could see how the national monarchs, with the absolutist monarchs, asserted their role against the Roman Church. Now, the third point I've given here is the spirit of humanism. It was a spirit which, in fact, gathered a lot of momentum during the Renaissance period, the spirit of humanism, where man is placed as a center of life, not anything theological, not anything biblical. So the spirit of humanism actually gave people a sense of what to say, an identity with their nation more, not with the Church of Rome. Okay, now the features. When we say absolutism, what do you actually understand by that? You can see how the monarchies gradually evolved. They gradually usurped power. They became centralized in nature. They were centralized regimes. They had diplomats and spies too, because they were so doubtful about whether they would be attacked. So they had diplomats and spies to assist them to see whether there were discontent from the side of, whether there was discontent from the side of the people. No. Now another feature that you can see is how the monarch inherited throne through the law of primogeniture. That is, when the eldest son, the firstborn male child, succeeded father to the throne. That is the law of primogeniture, which was applied in all these cases. So they made their position safe by making their firstborn child as their successor. That is the law of primogeniture. Now we could see how these monarchs, through controlling power, overshadowed the traditional assemblies, feudal assemblies of the medieval period. A feudal parliament, assemblies which no longer were bodies that had any say in any matter. They were relegated, they were kind of slighted and marginalized. Now, we can also see how there were some positive impacts as far as these countries were concerned when such centralized regimes were established. We could see how these rulers, they wanted to assert power, they wanted to build huge empires. So they realized that only through colonization it was possible. So like you know how Queen Elizabeth had sponsored a lot of traders, a lot of rulers of the period, Isabella, they all had sent traders to various parts of the world to find new colonies, and that in fact began, that is how you can trace the history of colonization, and that in fact led to the rapid growth of Europe. That is why I stated that this was good for the countries which were the colonial powers, how they had rulers whose primary interest was to build huge empires. Now another significant development can be seen as a rise of national identity. Like when you say I'm an Indian, or a person connects with his country first, that is national identity. So here how we can see when there was a ruler who was a very powerful figure, a very centralized kind of a person, people tended to connect with him more than with a church or any other body for that perhaps. And so loyalty to one's homeland gradually developed with these monarchs. Now what can you see as achievements of the absolutist monarchs? They were able to reduce the powers of feudal lords, aristocrats. They created centralized regimes which were so efficient in extracting taxes from the people. So a very well efficient taxation system, because they knew that for them to rule they wanted taxes. And they wanted a very good method of taxation which which gradually got evolved in this period. Then they maintained a very strong, powerful army and which was loyal to the monarch. Now, then regarding national identity, I discussed that point earlier. Now you can see that these monarchs, they encouraged trade, because they realized that Only through trade they could prosper, their countries could prosper. Then they tried enforcing religious unities with other countries. They were able to curb the growth or power of clergy, that means church. Now, since we are studying about England, we really have to know about absolutism in England. Though it was a trend in various other parts, in England also we see England being one of the oldest and complex systems of rule, kingly rule. Now, we know that you must have studied last year how King John, this is history, King John was forced to sign Magna Carta by his nobles. He was forced to give a lot of privileges to the nobles. That was in 1215 AD. So even after this particular incident, we could see how the Parliament in fact tried to control the king when the king tried to act powerful. That could be seen in England. That is why I have given this slide. There was a continuous push and pull between the king and the parliament. Struggle between the king and parliament, the crown and parliament, can be seen in the entire history of England. Now, when we talk about the Tudors, we know that Tudors, I told you, the benevolent despots, they turned towards mercantilism, they concentrated on colonization. Queen Elizabeth was known for her special interest in literature, art, and also for religious tolerance. So it was a benevolent despot. Now let's see what happened after the Tudors. The Stuarts were there in power. Stuarts, like we know that James first, Charles first, Charles second, and finally James second. Stuart rulers, they fought with the parliament. They were not very powerful rulers, but then at the same time they were absolutists, and that led to a civil war in 1642. That was between Charles first, ruler, and parliamentarians. So here in this image, I have given a picture which says Cavaliers versus Roundheads. Now Cavaliers were royalists who supported the king. They were called as Cavaliers because they rode on horses. And on the other side, the group that opposed the king, the Parliamentarians, they were known as the Roundheads. Why? Because for a particular way that they cut their hair in a round shape. So they were called Roundheads. So Cavaliers versus Roundheads, that could be seen in 1642. That's a civil war. So you can see in England a situation where the hatred against the king led to a civil war. A civil war is something which happened inside a nation, not influenced by a foreign power. So here the Cavaliers versus Roundheads, which ultimately led to the assassination of the ruler, that is Charles I, was killed by the parliament. So that is how certain monarchs, absolutists, were not liked by the parliamentarians. They ruled without the parliament for a very long time. They raised taxes according to their interests. They dragged England to numerous wars without the consent of the parliament. Parliament was silent for a long time. But then beyond a certain extent, parliament could not. King, in fact, had support of the nobles. Now, parliament at that time had a lot of what I can say, rich people, business class, traders, educated people. They could not beyond an extent tolerate absolutism of the ruler. So we could see that a lot of clashes were there in the Stuart period between the king and the parliament, and there was the glorious revolution of 1689. That too was a major result. You can see how it was due to this friction between the king and the parliament, which resulted in the glorious revolution. So I have given here the Stuarts for you, the names in order: James I, Charles II, and James II. Then you have William and Mary, who joint rule by William and Mary after the glorious revolution, and finally Queen Anne, who ruled till 1714. So Stuarts roughly 1603, 1714. Sometimes you see, like some in books, they say how the Stuart rule came to an end in 1689 with the glorious revolution, because William was a foreigner, though he was a son-in-law of James II. About that we discuss later. So this is how absolutism functioned in England, and you can see how they use very much the divine right theory to assert their powers over people. So continuous struggle between the king and parliament could be seen. Okay, bye bye. Thank you.